cries out to heaven. The Holy Father renews his calls for an end to the military conflict in Ukraine. We have a report from Rome. Coronavirus funding. As Democrats look to pass another relief bill, Republicans seek answers regarding immigration. We're on Capitol Hill. Crisis in Afghanistan. Analysis of the situation in the country months after the United States withdrawal. And a missions anniversary. How the largest archdiocese in the United States is celebrating a milestone. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, April 6, 2022. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. Talks between Ukraine and Russia continue. Meantime, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelinsky accuses the Russian military of war crimes. Moscow strongly denies the claim. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says the negotiations are tough and the disagreement over possible war crimes is hurting progress. Meantime, the head of NATO warns the military conflict, quote, may last a long time. Meantime, Pope Francis is renewing his calls for an end to the war in Ukraine.
O immigrante è unico. Non è un numero, è una persona, è unico.
At his weekly talk to pilgrims at the Vatican, Pope Francis said it is time to stop, quote, sowing death and destruction in Ukraine. He also reflected on his recent two-day trip to Malta, but his remarks on the military conflict left the strongest impression. Joining us now from Rome is Andreas Thonhauser, EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief. Andreas, great to see you. During the general audience today, Pope Francis again urged for peace and had some strong words. Can you talk to us more about that?
Yeah, Tracy, as you can imagine, the war in Ukraine is still the big concern here at the Vatican. As we reported previously, Pope Francis has not only condemned the atrocities committed by Russian forces on his in-flight press conferences coming back from Malta last Sunday, but also today at the general audience, he found incredibly strong words. Now, let me quote, "The blood of civilians cries out to heaven," he said, referencing the unbelievable atrocities that were reported over the weekend in Bucha in Ukraine. In the little village northwest of Kiev, Russian forces allegedly committed war crimes and left behind mass graves with tortured bodies. At the end of the audience, Pope Francis held a Ukrainian flag that he received from Bucha and showed it to the people attending. He also asked a few Ukrainian children who were present to come and join him on stage. Young war refugees are currently being treated at the Vatican Children's Hospital Bambino Gesù. Pope Francis asked the audience to pray for the children and their families, and then he gave them some sweets for Easter. But what was really striking, Tracy, was the way he deplored the impotence, the powerlessness of the United Nations. Rarely have you heard a Pope comment that fiercely on this international body. After the Second World War, he said, we tried to establish peace in the long term, but we seem not to be learning.
And also, Andreas, we hear that Pope Francis actually intends to visit Kyiv and possibly Lebanon. Do we know if he has any other visits planned?
That's right, Tracy. So after Pope Francis has canceled his trip to Florence earlier this year because of health problems, many doubted he would actually be able to go to Malta, where he just returned from. But coming back from Malta to Rome, he said at the in-flight press conference that he intends to go to Kiev. When asked how realistic it was, also for security reasons, by some of the journalists traveling with him, he said that, and I quote, he was willing to do whatever needs to be done because war is always inhuman, he said. He called it an expression of the spirit of Cain, alluding to the biblical figure of the murder of his brother Abel in the Old Testament. There were rumors that he would also go to Lebanon, and this has been started by Michel Ayoun, the Lebanese president. He visited Pope Francis before the pontiff went to Malta, and then he tweeted about this possible journey. So far, the Vatican has only reminded everyone that this trip has not been confirmed in any way. High members of the Roman Curia, the church leadership, hinted that a trip to Ukraine was very much pursued. As you can imagine, Tracy, this would be a bold and impressive gesture, and maybe also what is needed to bring peace if we see Pope Francis in Ukraine.
Andreas, we have maybe about a minute left or so, but I'm curious. You had mentioned Pope Francis saying basically the UN is powerless in the situation in Ukraine. So what can we do as people to help the people of Ukraine?
Well, basically, the Vatican and the Pope have done so far two things. First, they tried to achieve as much as possible on the diplomatic level, like the Pope went to the Russian ambassador here in Rome, something unheard of in recent history, and the Secretariat of State sought close connections to Russian contacts in government and church. But secondly, there's the spiritual side, and that's also where we can join Pope Francis with the consecration of Russia and Ukraine to Our Lady of Fatima, his constant urge to pray for the people in these countries, and the many masses celebrated here. So with the possible trip to Kiev, a third thing also is added. If Pope Francis travels to the war-torn country, and he seems to be ready to go within the next weeks, his presence could become a tipping point for peace, something that we all could really pray for.
Absolutely. Well, Andreas, thank you so much for your time today. We always appreciate it. Andreas Thonhauser, EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief. Thank you again.
Thank you, Tracy.
President Joe Biden and U.S. allies have agreed to inflict even more financial pain on Russia. The new sanctions announced today even target Russian President Vladimir Putin's two daughters. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen.
Tracy, good evening to you. In a speech before North America's building trades union at the Washington Hilton, President Biden said Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, still stands and that the fight is far from over.
President Joe Biden announces more sanctions on Russia.
And together with our allies and our partners, we're going to keep raising the economic cost and ratchet up the pain for Putin and further increase Russia's economic isolation.
That ratcheting up includes full blocking sanctions on Russia's largest financial institution, banning any new U.S. investment in Russia, and going after more Russian elites and their families.
These oligarchs and their family members are not allowed to hold on to their wealth in Europe and the United States and keep these yachts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, their luxury vacation homes, while children in Ukraine are being killed, displaced from their homes.
The Biden administration also says its sanctions exempt humanitarian items like food, agricultural commodities, and medicine, and will allow access to the internet, which provides outside perspectives to the Russian people.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Justice Department already filed criminal charges against a Russian oligarch accused of sanctions violations. And Attorney General Merrick Garland says they blocked a cyber attack launched by the GRU, Russia's military intelligence agency.
The Justice Department will use every available tool to find you, disrupt your plots, and hold you accountable.
And as Ukraine collects evidence of Russian atrocities on the ruined outskirts of Kyiv, hundreds of bodies, victims of what appears to be intentional killings of civilians by Russian forces. In a speech today, President Biden told the union members the Ukrainian military will keep getting uninterrupted supplies.
President Biden also warned that the war could continue for a long time, but added the U.S. will continue to stand with Ukraine. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
Democrats on Capitol Hill are anxious to approve a new multi-billion-dollar COVID relief package. The money would be used to pay for treating another possible COVID outbreak. But bipartisan backlash to the Biden administration's decision to relax pandemic restrictions at the U.S. southern border is blocking passage. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales has that story.
The $10 billion bipartisan bill is less than half of what the Biden administration had asked for. Last month, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was forced to drop $15 billion in COVID relief from the government funding bill after pushback from her own party. This bill includes $5 billion to purchase and develop new COVID vaccines in the event the virus mutates, $750 million for research, clinical trials, and expanding vaccine manufacturing, plus millions more for Health and Human Services to use for other COVID-related purposes. Supporters say the bill is fully paid for by using previous unspent COVID relief funds, but Republicans and even a few Democratic senators are demanding Title 42 be added. Title 42 gives U.S. Border Patrol agents the right to turn away illegal migrants due to COVID concerns. President Biden announced come May he's doing away with the Trump-era policy.
I think there'll have to be an amendment on Title 42 in order to move the bill. There are several other amendments that we're going to want to offer, and so we'll need to enter into some kind of agreement.
This is a bipartisan agreement that does a whole lot of important good for the American people. Vaccines, testing, therapeutics. It should not be held hostage for an extraneous issue.
Senator Rick Scott tells me the Biden administration can't have it both ways.
The Biden administration needs to, get their story straight. On one hand, they say, oh, give us billions and billions of dollars for COVID relief. On the other side, they say, oh, we don't have a COVID problem if you want to come across the border, right? That's pretty inconsistent.
The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops supports dropping Title 42. Quote, we welcome the end of this harmful policy. We urge the Biden administration to implement a comprehensive plan for the border that ensures the humane treatment of all persons and respects their God-given dignity while safeguarding due process. Currently, the bill does not include any international COVID relief aid. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
And joining us now to discuss is Nate Hochman, Inter-collegiate Studies Institute Fellow at National Review. Nate, welcome. Great to have you on. We appreciate it. As we heard in Eric's report, there seems to be a lot of mixed messaging coming out of the Biden administration when it comes to COVID policy. They're ending Title 42 next month, but yet want billions of dollars of new funding for COVID relief. Can you help us unpack this?
Right. Well, it's pretty clear the Democrats want to have it both ways on this. So on one hand, you have Biden continuing to talk about COVID funding. Just a couple weeks ago, Nancy Pelosi used COVID as an excuse to extend absentee voting allowances for members of Congress. But at the same time, they're using the end of the pandemic as an excuse to basically further weaken our border security efforts down at the southern border, which is something that left-wing activists have been pushing for a long time. So it's pretty obvious, I think, to the American people and even some Democrats that this isn't actually about public health. It's about their ideology when it comes to border enforcement, and I think that's going to be borne out in the coming weeks.
Yanni, I want to talk a little bit more about the border here. Some former Trump administration officials are encouraging Governor Greg Abbott of Texas to declare an invasion at our southern border, since that would allow for greater ability to expel migrants from the country. Curious, what do you think of that strategy, and how do you see that playing out?
Well, look, it's obviously a radical strategy. It's not something that red state leaders have taken before, but it's also clear that the situation on the border is something that requires a pretty radical response, and red state leaders down in Texas and Arizona are not getting any help from the federal government, which means that they have to take these steps. So obviously, normal immigration is not the same thing as a military invasion, but the argument that you hear from these folks, which is convincing, is that Mexico is effectively a narco state, and the immigration crisis is being engineered by cartels, which are heavily armed and militarized, and it's reasonable to think of that as actually a hostile foreign power and to respond accordingly.
Yeah, on a different note, I want to talk about Indiana. Indiana's Republican governor vetoed legislation that would ban biological males from participating in women's sports. The American Principles Project released a poll that found 42% of Indiana voters strongly disapprove and 11% somewhat disapprove of the governor's veto. And it seems, this sentiment is not exclusive to the state of Indiana. I mean, we're seeing these conversations really take place across the nation. Your thoughts?
Right. What you saw from this polling was what was apparent to a lot of us before we saw any numbers at all, which is that more socially liberal and moderate Republican governors like Holcomb, like Spencer Cox in Utah, are completely out of step with their voters on social issues like transgenderism and gender ideology. In Utah, Spencer Cox vetoed a similar legislation and was overridden by the state legislature in a matter of days. So there are real costs to Republicans who are on the wrong side of their voters on these culture war issues, and I think the polling bears that out pretty clearly in Indiana.
Not a whole lot of time left, maybe about a minute or so, but I want to get your take on this. Elon Musk, as you know, recently invested $2.64 billion in Twitter, making him the biggest shareholder and also earning him a seat on the board. I'm curious, what do you think his plan is here? I mean, why is he investing so much in Twitter when it seems many people are leaving the platform and choosing alternatives?
Well, look, I take Elon Musk at his word. He's a wacky, crazy person, as most geniuses are, but I think the man is amazing. And it's pretty clear to me that he shares a lot of Americans' concerns about the future of free speech on these digital public square platforms like Twitter, and wants to do something about it. And I think we should applaud him for that. I see no reason to be skeptical. I think the American people should be pretty optimistic about his involvement in the company going forward.
All right. And before I let you go, I want to give you the last word. What else are you following?
Just a lot of the state-level culture war fights. So critical race theory, gender identity, et cetera, all of these things are things that red states are really aggressively tackling, and they're going to continue to do so. And it'll be very interesting to see which Republican governors are on the right side and which ones are on the wrong side in the coming months.
All right, we'll leave it right there. Nate, great to have you on. Thank you so much for your time and analysis today.
Thanks, Tracy. Appreciate it.
Coming up, Eye on Hong Kong. New developments as the former British territory seeks to find a new chief executive. Plus, analysis of conditions in Afghanistan after months of Taliban control. In Hong Kong, the city's #2 official has stepped down with political ambitions in mind.
The reason for my resignation is that if my resignation is approved by the Central People's Government, I shall plan to prepare to stand for the upcoming chief executive election.
John Lee is seen as Beijing's favored candidate to succeed Carrie Lam. In response to protests, authorities in Shanghai will allow parents to stay with their children who have COVID-19. Other COVID prevention protocols remain in place. Parents must still wear masks, eat separately, and avoid sharing personal items. Shanghai remains under complete lockdown to fight China's latest coronavirus outbreak. Peru's president has retracted a curfew which was intended to quell political unrest over inflation. Pedro Castillo had imposed, then suspended, emergency measures within less than a day. More than 1,000 people had taken to the streets to protest a stay-at-home order in Lima. Opposition lawmakers had called the lockdown illegal. The Taliban announces a ban on harvesting poppy plants typically used in producing opium and other drugs like heroin and morphine. Farmers who continue to grow poppy plants can be jailed and have their crops burned. The Taliban has also outlawed the transportation and trade of alcohol, rules that are reminiscent of the Taliban's previous reign back in the 1990s. And joining us now to discuss is Charles Ramsey, Senior Fellow for the South and Southeast Asia and Middle East Action Teams at the Religious Freedom Institute. He is also a resident scholar at the Baylor University Institute for the Studies of Religion. Charles, welcome. Great to be with you. I want to talk a little bit more about the ban, but first, I want to touch on the ongoing unrest in Afghanistan. Today, a grenade was thrown into a mosque, wounding 6 people, and earlier this week, there was an explosion that killed 1 person and then wounded nearly 60 others. What more do you know about these acts of violence, and what do you think it signals?
Afghanistan continues to be a very dangerous place. People are trying to get on with their life, trying to understand the new situation, but events like this remind them that there's a long way ahead, a lot of work left to do. The Taliban, of course, is having to communicate to people and to the world that they are an effective government, that they can take control. And right now, a lot of what they're going to do is try to communicate to the global community that they are a force to be reckoned with. So they are going to, stop the sale of alcohol and the poppy production. Yes, there are real reasons for that, but it's also to communicate a sense of control and stability to the international community. Attacks on mosques like this are real threats to stability and undermine their leadership. So the news today was that this was somehow related to crime, that someone was trying to rob the money market. The mosque is a beautiful central mosque in the town. It's a symbol of community and really a central place of worship. And so an attack there can demoralize and give the picture that their grip is not as strong as it wants to be. Now, of course, they have other players, such as ISIS, who have a different ideology and are wanting to keep a grip or keep part of their position of strength in the country, which is a threat to the Taliban.
You know, you touched on that ban, and I want to go back to that again. But why do you think that's significant? I mean, what type of impact do you think it ultimately could have on the country?
Well, access to that kind of money can destabilize a region and can remove loyalty. So it's a moral stand. They're saying we can stop drug production, which the United States and its forces never could succeed in doing. So look at us, we're a moral force, and we're going to exert power here and show that we can do it. But it's also trying to stop the flow of cash that is associated with that industry. And we have to realize that it was enough of a supply chain to strengthen the Taliban when they needed access to it, and they don't want to allow that avenue for their opponents or for those who would want to threaten their control.
Yeah, and as we know, the economy in Afghanistan is really in turmoil right now, so much that the United Nations, I understand, is trying to raise over $4 billion in aid for the people of Afghanistan. That said, if that money is raised, I mean, what do you think the chances are that the Afghan people will actually receive that aid?
It's hard to say. Right now, that is, it sounds like a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not. It's not enough to solve Afghanistan's problems. It's not enough to feed Afghanistan's hungry. There are real and very pressing needs there. And we want to continue as an international community to be involved. But I think, again, those funds are going to be tied to political strings. They're going to be tied to relationships, and they're related to affirming the position of the government and to creating diplomatic ties. And I'm just not sure that we're at that place yet. I know the U.S. government is saying we're not at that place yet. But at the same time, it's important to realize that there is active trade going on through the informal sector. So it's not like there's not money coming into Afghanistan and going out. A lot of the Afghan economy is on the informal, operates through informal means. And so there are billions of dollars in trade happening through fuel and commercial goods and food items that are coming across those very porous borders. Afghanistan is sometimes called the heart of Asia, and because so many passageways go right through there. And so I don't think that releasing these funds are going to make the difference that we hope it will be, that they hope they'll accomplish. But it would signify to the Taliban government that we want to engage and we want to begin a process of coming back to the table and figuring out how to move forward in this very complex situation.
Well, Charles, thank you so much for weighing in. We really appreciate your time today.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
Up next, fight for the unborn. Two neighboring states pursue opposite laws on abortion. Plus, a leading archbishop draws inspiration from a vandalized mission church. We'll explain. Colorado has a new law which codifies a right to abortion and contraception. The state's governor says it will assure access to so-called family planning. Denver's Archbishop Samuel Aquila calls it, quote, a triumph for the culture of death. 15 other U.S. states and the District of Columbia have similar laws. Meanwhile, the Oklahoma House has approved a bill that would make it a felony for a person to perform an abortion. Republican Senator James Inhofe calls it a victory.
I have no doubt that we would be considered the most pro-life state because this is a position that it's very popular in Oklahoma, and but we've never seen it in the extreme form, and I'm glad we are.
Now, the measure does make an exception to save the life of a pregnant woman in a medical emergency. The bill moves to the governor for his signature. Now, the Bishop of Worcester, Massachusetts, has warned a Jesuit-run middle school about its outside flag display. Bishop Robert McManus recently learned about the flying of rainbow and Black Lives Matter flags at the school. He says their symbolism could cause confusion about church teaching on marriage and civil authority. If the flags remain, the school could lose its Catholic designation. For more details, they are available with our online partners at Catholic news agency And finally tonight, Archbishop Jose Gomez is celebrating the 250th anniversary of the first Christian mission in Los Angeles. The Archbishop addressed more than 1,700 people during Mass at Mission San Gabriel Archangel on Saturday, where an arson fire had damaged the chapel in July of 2020. Archbishop Gomez invited the faithful to imitate St. Junipero Serra's trust in God. After Mass, there was a 10-mile procession downtown to the city's Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels. And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.